The Borderlands series is replete with memorable characters in unconventional situations. One of these, which is defiantly etched into my brain, is Mad Moxxi. You might call Moxxi aesthetically straightforward. She's a queenie showgirl whose first and foremost characteristics are her status as a Mad Max reference and her sexuality. Underneath the facade of a flirtatious fatal femme, Moxxi's ideals range from cutthroat to heartwarming. She loves her children, even if she isn't the best mother. She's always willing to fight for what she wants, even if she's outwardly unassuming. However, ironically, there's layers to Moxxi. Her outward physical appearance and innuendo-obsessed behavior isn't pure facade. If her romantic history is anything to go by, she does also sleep around quite a lot. She isn't totally kidding when she flirts with the player, or at least there's a question of how opaque her intentions are. She might not mean anything she says, but presumably she said a lot of it to the people she both did and did not sleep with, so who knows? Moxxi is a character who's hard to parse. If you're familiar with Borderlands, you've probably heard it all before, and don't need me to regurgitate it all back to you. Hopefully, it suffices to say that she strikes me as having been written by creatives who liked her ambiguity, who wanted the player to think, wait, what? When she said something? Or to have a laugh and then ask, wait, hang on, did she really say that? Moxxi takes everyone a little by surprise. I think that's why I feel like everyone gets her wrong, and more than that, I think the fact that we have such a hard time discussing her unravels some of our issues with how we approach women, sexuality, and seeing both together in discussions about video games. That's what we're here today to discuss, but it's going to take a bit of unraveling. In her essay, Unquestioned Assumptions, originally written for her book The Wave in the Mind, Talks and Essays on the Writer, the Reader, and the Imagination, legendary feminist author Ursula Le Guin expounds upon the tendency of authors to consider only their own in-group and its perspectives, saying, quote, "The unquestioned assumption, the mistake of thinking we all think alike, is less often made by writers who belong to a minority or oppressed social group. They know all too clearly the difference between us and them. The confusion of us with everybody is most tempting to people who are members of one or more of the privileged or dominant groups in their society." Le Guin tackles ignorance empathetically but severely, saying, "These days, no writer can legitimately claim either ignorance or innocence as a defense of prejudice or bigotry in their writing." She looks over a few different assumptions writers sometimes make, like treating their audiences as if we're all white or all young. One of my all-time favorite quotes from her originates in this essay, where she describes writers who assume their audiences are all Christian or will respond appropriately to Christian imagery as taking, quote, "a free ride on the cross," end quote. It seems like a lot of the time, bad YouTube commentators are getting free rides on discount crosses, burning crosses even. But before there was that phenomenon, there was the prior phenomenon not to be named. When games critic Anita Sarkeesian made videos on video game tropes and women's issues through the Feminist Frequency channel, it turned out a lot of people had a lot to say about it. I won't regale you with tales of those times. However, Le Guin's words on our unquestioned assumptions had me thinking about the introduction of certain terms to mainstream video game discourse, in particular in examples like these.
By contrast, the way that women move in games isn't just used to suggest their confidence or their skill or some other facet of their personality. It's very often used in conjunction with other aspects of their design to make them exude sexuality for the entertainment of the presumed straight male player. In fact, animating so many female characters in games to fit into this very gendered, sexualizing walk pattern is an example of one of the ways the male gaze manifests in video games. The term male gaze was coined in 1975 by feminist film critic Laura Mulvey and refers to the tendency for the visual arts to assume and be structured around a presumed masculine viewer, or in this case, player.
Back in the day, a lot of people weren't so charitable to Sarkeesian, to put it mildly, which isn't to say you have to think she was always in the right, but just that it's probably still controversial in some circles to look at an old video like this and say she might have had some things worth saying. She didn't bring up Moxxi here, but she might as well have when discussing how female characters walk, move, and stand. What sticks out to me here isn't the use of the idea of the male gaze, but rather another phrase that you might have noticed, and how it arises from this way of thinking about the relationship of portrayals of women to the viewing or gaming experience. What is interesting about the popular use of terms like the male gaze in discussions of art and media is that they trend towards the hyper-literal. In my experience, when social media critics of what they call the male gaze make it their objective to show forth this phenomenon, they frequently present it in terms that suggest that what they wish to consider and what they hold to be at issue is desire, and implicitly heterosexual male desire. Similarly, when critics of those critics, or critics of feminism and left-wing analysis more generally, make this discussion a feature of their rhetoric, their clear pain point is rather similar. What is at issue for many of these commentators is heterosexual male desire, which is the desire, the only desire, or the main desire. Heterosexuality is, in this view, the only game in town, and men are up on the leaderboard. It is perhaps unsurprising that some of the feminist critics, or critics who we are led to believe are supposedly espousing some form of feminism, also present a troubled view of sex in their commentaries. I think if we look to Le Guin's essay, we can see the chance for something rather different. Previously, the male gaze as an idea was intended to signify a trend within art that presents women, first and foremost, as female bodies without agency. It is basically a trend in presentation, but its real object of critique is the work and the artist. It does not hold the viewer in contempt, or otherwise it could not forward its analysis without confessing some form of guilt. Mulvey denounces the moralistic approach, but makes it clear that her work is analytical, and that she is familiar with the view that analyzing the pleasure of beauty destroys it, which does seem to be reflected in these surface-level discourses we have around the idea of a male gaze. Because the tradition of this type of art critique is psychoanalytic, it is predicated on an evaluation of our society as phallocentric, which is a more enlightened way we might regard as the normative reconstitution of all of our implicit ways of thinking around cisgender heterosexual male power. The term is usually attributed to an essay by Laura Mulvey titled Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Mulvey argues, "Woman's desire is subjugated to her image as bearer of the bleeding wound. She can exist only in relation to castration, and never transcend it." This is to say that women symbolize in patriarchal society a lack of male power, and therefore a threat to it, and therefore an object of it. Failing to belong to that final category leaves a woman in such a society with nothing in the end. Literary audiences, especially consumers of romantic literature, may here begin to recognize a problem. It is very much the case in many of these works of literature that a woman's power comes from being desired, which would seemingly presuppose her status as an object in a subject-object relation. This is basically what Mulvey is talking about. This way of thinking, however, as I previously observed in an essay about Dragon Age Inquisition, Sarah, John Berger, and lesbian romances in video games, carries with it a certain implication. Mulvey describes the woman in this sense as existing with reference to a man as a silent image, or as Berger might have put it, her role is to be consumed. Who consumes her? The heterosexual cisgender man. Our theory of patriarchy, while descriptively accurate, thus develops a tendency to prescribe cisgender heterosexuality. This tendency is not unfamiliar to many of Laura Mulvey's critics, but to be perfectly fair to her, it doesn't precisely threaten her analytical observations. Proponents of a kind of female gaze sometimes argue that when the subject of a film is female but the cinematographer is also female, the portrayal of female subjects is more humanizing. It would certainly seem to follow from the ways that critics like Mulvey and Berger have explored this idea. This is curious, however, because we do not tend to treat power and gender relations this way when considering depictions of gay male sexuality. It seems to me that a cinematographer could shoot a man, or a painter could paint a man, in much the same way as we see in real cases of the male gaze at work, and without threatening his power. They don't tend to, of course, which is naturally understood as symptomatic of a normative heterosexual point of view. After all, if a heterosexual man imagined himself in that circumstance, he might find that manner of being desired, of being an object of male desire, uncomfortable. Le Guin affirms why this might be the case. She argues, a negatively stereotyped fag or dyke is presented by the author with a verbal wink, an invitation to more or less hateful laughter from the reader. She also sees the aforementioned lack of equity in presentation, what she describes as vivid descriptions of the bodies and faces of sexually attractive young women, but not of men or older women. This is something which occurs to many readers of books, viewers of shows, and players of games. Why can't the men be presented as the women are? Previously, the argument tended to be taken seriously the other way around, and so we've arrived at a place where female characters are in many cases now presented as men are, to the dissatisfied jeering of audiences perturbed by this equity. Variety being the spice of life, it might be more ideal to have an even-handed approach. Why, the gamers ask, are we not objectifying men as well as women? A better question might be, why call it objectification when in theory what we're imagining is equitable and humanizing? Sarkeesian has words for this idea and presented them frankly almost a decade ago in the aforementioned video.
Eradicating the male gaze is not as simple as introducing an inverse female gaze that sexualizes men either. Not just because equal opportunity sexual objectification isn't the answer, but also because it isn't actually equal. One reinforces pre-existing oppressive ideas about women that are real and damaging to women in their everyday lives. The other doesn't reinforce anything. Nor are the two interchangeable. For example, when the satirical website The Hawkeye Initiative reimagines male characters in sexualized poses that are common for female characters, it isn't using the female gaze. This is just the male gaze applied to men. When male characters are depicted as shirtless or wearing little clothing, like the character sometimes dubbed Hot Ryu from Street Fighter V, their lack of clothing demonstrates their power and strength, rather than depicting them as erotic playthings or reducing them to sexualized body parts.
If we can be allowed to chew on these comments a bit more before proceeding, I would only add a few things. First, the basic orientation of Sarkeesian's assertion is the correct one. There should be some accounting for the fact that we're dealing with unequal power relations. That is, after all, inherently posited by any description of phallocentric culture. On the other hand, it must be noted what might be contained within this concept of reducing women to sexualized portrayals. Any confinement of a category of human beings to a limited purview of expression is a reduction and therefore unjustified, but similarly, the prevention of what we here call sexualization might begin to foster a paranoia around sex and sexuality, which could be troublesome given some of the unquestioned assumptions made within the male gaze itself. The feminist frequency video is probably too short and maybe too early in the culture to even begin to address that problem. And in order to question those assumptions, we would have to first acknowledge our power relations. It's easy to see why Sarkeesian's remarks angered so many, especially for reasons they might not have wanted to admit. I've seen it said a few times over the years that it is natural or even necessary that female characters be objectified, because after all, is a fictional representation not an object? You're treating them like what they are. People do like to play with words this way, so I hope I can be clear here. While representations of people are objects, either physically or conceptually, what is meant by this specific objection to objectification is both the unequal dynamic and the effect on the material. Mulvey is right to state that, quote, in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact so that they can be said to connote to be looked at-ness. Woman displayed as sexual object is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle, end quote. This is to acknowledge, again correctly, that the tradition of our visual arts in specific mediums in specific periods of the Western canon or related global movements presents men as agents and women as objects. To be male is to see, to be female is to be seen. To be a guy is to act, to be a gal is to be acted upon. This is the original use case of the male gaze. It is an acknowledgement of our usual way of seeing men and women differently, where it comes from and what it might say about us. It's easy to see where this might perturb some audiences. Not only is it the case that, as Mulvey describes, aesthetic delight can vanish when it is analyzed, although I don't know that I'd agree those feelings are inevitable, so receiving the critique may cause someone to feel they are being robbed of a pleasure. They may even feel, because gaming is a medium of generally some variety of active participation beyond simply viewing, that they are being discouraged from participating further, from continuing to play. They may feel they are being judged for what they have seen, that if there are complications in what they were presented, they now retain some marked status or moral impugnment of character, as if they were a real voyeur who saw something they shouldn't have. As a consequence of any of these feelings, they may simply wish to deny what they have seen. This is all very well and good for heterosexuals, not because it does them any good, but because it places them in a neat category where, like Le Guin discusses, we assume this entire discussion is a function of their point of view. Analytically, it is. There is a real historical power differential exercised against queer people in society. We've already discussed how this way of thinking about how we frame sexuality breaks down when we try to reframe it more equitably. But there's a deeper problem here. Because we cannot escape the culture we are in or the history from which we were made simply by wishing it were so, we cannot behave in good faith as if we can create any art that presents women for the consideration of the audience without it also existing in those prior contexts. The male gaze is real, and yet, one feature of the male gaze is its implicit demonstration of heterosexual dominance or heterosexual power. Critiques of the male gaze that fail to redress this power dynamic in favor of treating men as straight men and women as straight women are failing to deconstruct the male gaze itself, since the original offense was implicitly heteronormative in nature. Here, we can see the consequence of complaints of reducing women to sex objects. Whose objects? To whom do they belong? Surely not other women. They cannot because they could not belong to themselves because they were women, and so they cannot belong to other women either. This is not because lesbians are sexless. In fact, the treatment of lesbians as such is a recognition of lesbianism exclusively within the confines of the sexless space the male gaze has erected for it in the first place. We cannot assume we are all heterosexual because the texts tend to assume we are all heterosexual. Art shapes our consciousness. If gay women were allowed to express lesbian desire through this avenue, would they need to unbecome women first? If this is the character of women's situation in our society, then perhaps the message to women who want women as decoded by those who see something inherently wrong with the sexualization of women as perpetrated by an invariably male gaze, is that those women should try wanting something else. There are no ideal answers here. Moxxi is a fully fleshed out character with her own agency, her own rationale for adopting the posture she does, her own reasons for her own behaviors. We might remember that Moxxi is playfully aware of who she is, that she exists consciously, that sight and seeing are a part of her persona. Does her presentation reduce that too? Sarkeesian understood character animations to be an extension of the male gaze, but is this a trap? Is the portrayal in and of itself of certain acts by women necessarily part of the male gaze because it is a function of that phenomenon that is the sexual presentation of women in a cultural dynamic that flatters heterosexual male power? Or could something else be happening here as well? Is Moxxi available to be seen? More crucially, are the women who love Moxxi able to see her? It might be the case that Mulvey's arguments are predicated on a Freudian psychoanalytic tradition that, in its origins, did a poor job of accounting for the desires of gay people. But what about her arguments about the presentation of women? Berger's points were similarly open-minded, where he chiefly looked to the genre of the nude painting, as opposed to the question of whether a female character was naked. This distinction seems lost on so many. For the sake of argument, if it were possible for a woman or a female character to playfully engage with these domains of heterosexual masculine power, but in doing so thwart them, what would that look like? Sarkeesian is right to say there is no corresponding female gaze, but if so, how is a woman to see with her own eyes, as opposed to the eyes of a male spectator? We should be questioning the unquestioned assumption. Is what is contained within the male gaze forbidden knowledge to lesbians? Are we not then reproducing the prohibition on Eve against eating the fruit of God's tree of knowledge, where patriarchy then becomes God? Indeed, in these discussions, it seems describing the character of patriarchy has made its scope feel inescapable. Usually this means that the strength of such an unjust power dynamic is also rife with weakness. Could there be something liberating about seeing women through the gaze of women? In situations like this, we should be looking to the reverse. Le Guin has words for this. Quote, "Each unquestioned assumption has a possible opposite, a reverse, which if written into fiction would give us stories in which men occur only as sexual objects for women, where homosexuality is the social norm, where white skin has to be mentioned whenever it appears, where only godless anarchists act morally, or where adults rebel vainly against the bullying authority of children. Such books are, in my experience, rare. One might meet them in science fiction. Realistic fiction that merely questions or ignores the assumptions, however, is not unusual. We do have novels that assume that women represent humanity as well as men do, that gays or people of color or non-Christians represent humanity as well as heterosexuals, whites, or Christians do, or that the adult or parental view is as valuable as the childish one. The stigma of political correctness invoked by those who see all refusal of bigotry as a liberal conspiracy may be slapped on such books. They are often ghettoized by publishers and reviewers, segregated from fiction of general interest. If a novel is centered on the doings of men, or its major characters are male, white, straight, and/or young, nothing is said about them as members of a group, and the story is assumed to be of general interest. If the major characters are women or black or gay or old, reviewers are likely to say that the book is about that group, and it is assumed, even by sympathetic reviewers, to be of interest chiefly or only to that group. Thus, both the critical establishment and the publisher's publicity and distribution tactics lend immense authority to prejudice. A writer may not want to defy both the reactionary critical establishment and the pusillanimous marketplace. I just want to write this novel about the kind of people I know. I just want to see my book. Fair enough. But how much collusion with prejudice, disguised as unquestioned assumptions about what is normal, does it take to buy safety? End quote. How much indeed? For us on the other side as well, how much are we going to take? How much sitting on the sidelines? How much living inside someone else's eyes? How much watching turned into waiting, turned into being so little of ourselves we forget we're ourselves before we're anyone else? How much of yourself do you sell before there's nothing at all? It seems like women have lost, in all of this, the ability to see women and be seen by women with the full scope of society's component straight male desires. That seems wrong, but perhaps it was fitting that in order for women to exist exclusively to be seen, like Oedipus, we also had to lose our sight.